Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Pla.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Pla, at Andrew Pla Tech on socials. I'll see you there. And we have a very special episode in store for us today. We're going to explore some C# and then talk about some career successes and how we can emulate that in our lives. But let me first introduce longtime friend, since 2018, quite successful in your own right, which I think we'll talk about your tech career in a little bit. But Ryan Coates, welcome to the PowerShell Podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you, Andrew. I've been wondering when I was going to pop up on this thing for a while now, so I'm glad you've been running with it so long. It's always enjoyable to listen to it. So
every single Wednesday, you know how we do. But I'm glad we did get to circle back on this. I think we maybe talked about it before, and to be honest, if I talk about doing a conference with someone or with a podcast with someone at a conference, with how many conversations there are at conferences, I tend to lose it. So yeah, so I appreciate your willingness on this.
I've brought all my gear to a conference before to do similar things, and then it's like, oh, I never have it when I'm actually having a conversation.
Yep, absolutely. I've done that before where I planned to record interviews with all this camera stuff and then recorded zero. So yeah, that happens. And you also just presented at PowerShell Wednesday, right?
I did, yeah. We did some intro to, maybe not intro to C#. I think that's one of the challenges I try and overcome is that most people who are already seasoned PowerShell developers don't necessarily need an interest to C#. They just kind of need a transition to C#. Kind of, maybe not going through quite as many basics, but kind of showing them how easy it is to move from one language to the next. So that was kind of, we kind of showed a couple examples there and talked about why there's a lot of power in going down that path.
Yeah, and I think that'll be sort of the main topic of the first part of this episode because it's worth exploring. I think a lot of people, and you mentioned it right there, was you need to be at a certain level of PowerShell proficiency for making a pivot to C# to make sense. And I think a lot of people, as they go throughout their PowerShell journey, they see that opportunity, and maybe they take it. I know I personally have not. I have not dove into C#. Yes, I've ran into it often. Right? Am I actually editing code? No, I would look at it, be pretty confused, not really know the public class void, all that stuff. I would just have to ignore it because I never looked up what it did. And then kind of find the bits that looked kind of PowerShell-y. Maybe there's an if loop or a for loop. Something like that I can understand. And then accessing methods. All right. But you did a really good job at kind of demystifying some of that and showing how it actually is a little bit approachable if you want to get started in C# and you have that foundation of programming.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I think, talking to people in the community, I think there are definitely some people in the PowerShell community who actually have started in software and maybe C# earlier on in its lifetime. And obviously it's come a long way and it's not the same beast as it used to be. I remember trying to learn C# multiple times back in the past in the older framework versions and just struggling with how complex it seemed to be and how difficult it seemed to be. So I definitely understand that. And I think it's a good next step for PowerShell folks because of the close interoperability that you can get between the two. So it's not like you haven't wasted either skill set. You can kind of use one to build on the other, and then you can use those new skills to reinform things you're doing in PowerShell. So I think it's a good complementary thing to expand into if you have interest in that space.
Some of my favorite people in the PowerShell community have a C# background, and another type of my favorite person in the PowerShell community, which may have some overlap, is people who take a DLL and wrap it and make it accessible in PowerShell for regular PowerShell commands. Those are some of my favorite projects that I rant on here the most about are DLLs that come from .NET and C#.
Yeah, again, it's just because obviously it's such a broader ecosystem given obviously C#'s footprint. PowerShell and its roots obviously have that kind of operations kind of focus. Obviously, you can do many more things. It's a Turing complete language, right? You do whatever you want with it, and a lot of people do. But that .NET ecosystem is huge and vast, and has been around for so long. There's so much to it. So many enterprise apps are built in it, which means there's so much supporting kind of enabling libraries and features and things like that. So if you can't find it in PowerShell, it's a good chance you might be able to find it in C#. So being able to use the best of both worlds, I think is definitely powerful.
Yeah, and I think for performance as well, if you want to get the most performance out of things for whatever reason, C# is going to be a better location for you. What are some other use cases though where C# kind of makes sense for a project?
I think, depending on where you're going and what your journey is. Like if you're still just looking to do kind of automation, like plus, right? Or you're like, I've got an automation problem I need to solve that PowerShell can't solve today, then probably not much further than building some libraries, right? I can grab some other modules, I can build some libraries, I can then wrap them up in PowerShell and do the needful. But I think a lot of folks, as they start dipping their toes in software, and ultimately that's what PowerShell is. If you're a PowerShell developer, you're a software developer, right? A lot of people see all the other potential, all the possibilities. Like much like makers and hackers see those possibilities in hardware and physical things. I think people who write software see those possibilities in bits. And it's like, what can I do? And C# obviously opens up a world of UIs, APIs, mobile apps, native apps. I mean, there's basically an answer to everything in the .NET ecosystem. And even if you don't want to go down the OOP route, then you've got things like functional programming with F# and I won't get started on the Q# quantum computing stuff. But again, it's a broad ecosystem, right? And again, the cool thing about .NET is, similar in a way to kind of that PowerShell promise that Jeffrey kind of made. If you learn it, we won't waste that investment. I think that's another thing about the .NET ecosystem. It's very broad, but if you ever learned VB.NET, like you understand the .NET ecosystem to a point, right? If you jump from C# to F#, other than the fact that you're using a different programming paradigm, you're not using a different ecosystem, right? You understand how to build projects, how to run projects, how to host projects. You're just learning a different way of programming, and that's never a bad skill set to have anyway, right? So again, I think there's definitely that kind of mindset of if you get invested in that ecosystem, it will pay dividends because it's such a broad ecosystem.
I think that on the PowerShell journey, eventually when someone gets to the point where they're on GitHub and they're contributing, maybe they have their own projects, maybe they're filing issues or PRs on other projects, I think that's a world opening moment for people. And I think the same can be said about when someone starts dabbling into something like C#. And then all of a sudden they get the confidence of that, they start dabbling in TypeScript. I've seen a lot of people in PowerShell kind of go down that path of exploring other languages, realizing there's a ton in common, and taking the easy wins that they can from whatever solutions they have available.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think it's one of those. There's a right tool for the job, and not every job requires the same tool. A lot of folks respond to some of my C# talks, and it's like, well, I can do that in PowerShell. Like, I don't disagree. There's a lot of things you can do in PowerShell. A lot of people have built tools to enable you to do those things in PowerShell because they want to solve that problem in a place that they're familiar with and they're comfortable with, right? And I think the challenge is it the right tool for the job? And again, a lot of us, I said this on the stream, a lot of us in the ops world, a lot of the constraint we have is time, right? We have to solve a problem now because we're fixing an issue or an outage or a performance problem. We're not building products. It's not what an ops team generally does. But as organizations have moved more towards that kind of DevOps SRE type model where you may be an operator on a product team, all of a sudden, you do start to participate and contribute to the product overall. And all of a sudden, things like the right tool for the job do matter, because now it's not about solving the problem the quickest way possible because there's an outage. It's about solving the problem the best way possible, right? For potential different use cases by different customers and, different things like that, right? So again, I always joke that I can write a hello world in like 50 languages. I can probably write a REST API in 30. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily particularly quick at doing it in some of those because I don't touch them too often. But in a lot of my previous roles, I've had to kind of evaluate what is the right tool for the job given the constraints that the business has at the time. Sometimes that's skill set. Hey, I've got a bunch of Java developers. Well, you know what we're going to write this program in then? Java, right? Other times it's we've got to get this done quick. I was like, well, maybe we write it in 3 different languages because the team we got to build it have 3 different backgrounds, right? I was like, the business constraint now is time, and other times you're going to get into domains and realms where the business constraint might be security, it might be performance, it might be memory footprint, things like that. And then again, there's different tools to solve those problems that make more sense, right? So again, PowerShell is not necessarily C# is not necessarily the end goal. There are many other languages that you could learn as well. I just think it's a good and supportive transitive kind of next step for a lot of PowerShell developers who are eager to learn more and do more with their software skills.
I think as people who work in tech, we are lifetime learners. I'd mentioned a lot on the podcast how it's really important to figure out how you learn best and continue to refine on that over time, because there is a constant of you're always going to be learning new things are be out of date. You got to keep it pushing forward. So we're paid for our perspective, and any excuse you can have to broaden that perspective and see things from a different light can only make you wiser and more valuable as an employee. So if C#, if there's something about it that maybe appeals to you, or you want to capitalize it to extend what you're doing in PowerShell and take advantage of new things, and maybe wrap one of those DLLs and give us that functionality in PowerShell through a module, well, you can do that and learn alongside, growing that resume. Because a lot of people, they find PowerShell, and I guess we'll talk about this in a little bit here too as well. They find PowerShell to be sort of a game changer for their careers in terms of what they are capable of, in terms of the value that they bring, in terms of the type of roles they can qualify for now, the type of business impact they can drive through automation. What's been your experience on adding tools like PowerShell to your workflow to have a career impact?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, it's interesting because I tried to teach myself. I'm mostly self-taught, right? I was an MCSE at 14. I was a CCIE by 20.
Wow.
I all of those things I was self-taught. Like there was no degree course for that type of stuff, right? And it was always interesting because when I was younger, I was always like, why isn't there a degree course for this stuff? And then you realize how quickly the field of expertise that you're expected to be proficient in operations changes. Like Windows 2000 was around, and then it wasn't. Then it was Windows XP, and then it was Windows 7, right? And then it was maybe there's one in the middle. You kind of went through these transitions very quickly, right? That version of the PIX firewall was replaced 2 years later by a different PIX firewall with a different kind of operating system and stuff like that. Whereas you go to learn C+, well, you could have learned C++ in the 70s, and C++ in the 90s and 2000s is incredibly similar, right? And so you can build a 4-year degree around those kind of concepts. In fact, a lot of the design patterns and principles around OOP and functional programming haven't actually changed in my lifetime, I imagine, since they were coined. There's slight style evolutions, like architectural considerations that tweak, but the concept of OOP, the concept of functional programming, the concept of computer science hasn't necessarily shifted too fundamentally in that period, right? So different kind of worldview. But so yeah, I agree with the whole lifelong learner thing. Like if you're in IT, like you don't really have much of a choice. This is just what we do. We learn something new every day. And PowerShell for me really helped me kind of fill some of those gaps in learning software. Learning software by yourself when you don't have anything particular to solve is challenging, right? It's, a lot of folks these days will talk to you about like project-based learning, like, hey, give me something to build and then I will learn. But like reading a book, a textbook or an academic kind of book is challenging, right? And, prior to modern times where our IDEs are very informative now, and now we have tools like AI, that makes troubleshooting problems very, very, well, I won't say very easy, but much easier than it used to. Like you're dealing with a compiled language like C# or Java back in the day, and you miss a semicolon somewhere, prior to your IDEs being as good as they were, you might get this whole block. Hey, yeah, there's an error somewhere in that subroutine. You're like, cool, man, that subroutine's 100 lines long. Like, what do you mean there's an error? I gotta go. And it gets very frustrating, especially when you don't have any guidance. You're not doing it with like a teacher or a TA or something like that. And so you end up kind of moving on, finding a different problem to solve, right? I think, with IDEs as powerful as they are today, and as precise and informative as they are today, with tools like AI, just like being able to grok your error message in a couple of seconds, it's much, much easier to kind of keep moving. And that's really the risk to learning, is when you stagnate for too long, you're going to move on. You're going to find something else to do because it's very frustrating. So if you're trying to do that yourself, the tools today make it much easier to kind of get there. So PowerShell was super useful to me because it has such a low barrier to entry. You opened up the ISE in Windows, you started writing stuff, and it started doing things. And I've been doing cloud for a long time, probably close to 20 years now. And when you started to do things like cloud, scale was important, right? You're putting things in cloud, like even prior to like IaaS in cloud, when we were doing things like 3C or before 365, things like BPOS, you're migrating 10,000 mailboxes. I was like, okay, well, I'm not clicking next 10,000 times. And if I just do a bulk move and there's an error at like mailbox 5, then I got to fire it up again. I got to fire it up again when it finds an error at mailbox 8. You're like, that's not workable. And so tools, it's interesting because Exchange, I think, was one of the first products from Microsoft that actually really took PowerShell seriously. I think the Exchange 2007 CLI was all just kind of built on top of PowerShell commands. I think it just ran PowerShell behind the scenes. And so for me, that was kind of super useful too, because you could kind of look at the code that it was going to run, even though you're just going through the GUI. So again, super easy for me to start, putting the two together and going, okay, this is useful. And again, I think, doing anything at scale like that clicking next thing, goes out the window. You can't operate like that at scale. And the cloud has definitely made more of us responsible for larger footprints than we potentially used to be. So,
Ryan, I know you've had a pretty impressive career, and I want to hear about that and what you're up to these days. But first, a quick word from our sponsors.
This is the PowerShell Podcast.
Most of you know the PowerShell Podcast is sponsored and made possible by PDQ. I've had questions from listeners asking, what's PDQ and what do you do? Well, we help IT teams automate endpoint management. PDQ Connect is our cloud-based tool for real-time software deployment, patching, scripting, remote access, and vulnerability management. It's fast, flexible, and built for people who just want things to work. If you want to see it in action, head to pdq.com/podcast and check out our interactive demo. No signups, no emails, no credit card, just a fast and easy way to explore how it works. That's pdq.com/podcast. Automated endpoint management that doesn't slow you down.
Now, back to the PowerShell Podcast.
So Ryan, you've had a pretty impressive career. I would love to hear a little bit about what your career has looked like, and then maybe wrap that up by telling us what you're up to these days.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think, it goes back to your lifelong learner thing, right? Like I've been doing this for a long time. I did my NT4 MCSE when I was a kid, basically. So that everybody needed to get an MCSE to do IT help desk stuff in London at the time. So that was kind of I'd say a high barrier to entry. There was a lot of folks who were struggling with that. And then there was this kind of period afterwards where you kept running into people who had like the paper MCSE, like they couldn't actually do the job. But I've always had a passion for IT. I've always, I worked in an internet cafe when I was in high school. Did network upgrades and stuff for them, kind of, installed software on like a fleet of machines, back when ISDN was the fastest internet we had. From there, I kind of moved from the NT world into kind of like it was interesting because a buddy of mine kind of helped me get some work. He was a novel netware kind of engineer, and he kept seeing all these NT work that he couldn't do, but he'd know that I'd been playing with NT3 and NT4. So he kind of just fobbed this work over to me back when I was like 16 or whatever. I was kind of doing that contract work then. Networking became a big part of that. So I kind of went down the Cisco route, got my Cisco networking certs and things like that pretty early in my career as well. And then VMware became a thing. I mean, I was using VMware from GSX1, I think. There was the older kind of type. What was that? Was that like a type 2 hypervisor? I'm trying to think if I'm getting the numbers mixed up. But yeah, GSX1 was like, I remember doing my MCSC messaging 2000 cert. By doing that, I basically found this thing where I could run a bunch of machines on my one machine. I was like, well, that's cool. And then I found this weird iSCSI software so I could run pretend storage, right? I was like, well, this is cool. And I'm sitting there with an entire Exchange cluster running on my desktop. And so that kind of got me into VMware and that kind of world. And I did VMware and data center stuff for a long time, which kind of led quickly into cloud. And yeah, and then cloud is interesting because cloud and DevOps kind of became a thing, and that kind of opened me to the world of software. And that's where kind of, so I already was kind of fairly multidisciplined, networking, servers, storage, stuff like that. And then obviously from that perspective, I'd done a lot of app support stuff. I hosted those apps. I helped run those IIS servers. I helped keep that website up and running. But kind of cloud helped me kind of get into that at a different level, right? Because it kind of changed some of those abstractions. So that's kind of when I started doing, software automation in order to do those things at scale. And that kind of led me down there. Well, I can just build software as well. And that kind of led me into, Python, C#, Java, Go, you name it. I kind of play around with it at some point. And then kind of it's gone a little bit full circle because then the application stuff became so broad that you started getting new operations platforms that come in, things like Kubernetes and stuff like that to help support those kind of microservice-based kind of applications at scale. And so kind of I found myself doing operations stuff again in the kind of Kubernetes realm. So yeah, it was kind of interesting journey over the last 30 odd years or something like that. Yeah, something stupid like that. But yeah, no, it's been really great. I think there's for those of you who are who are willing to kind of learn and adapt. I think I went for a lot of jobs early in my career. It was always changing, and sometimes that's looked at as a negative. I never looked at it like that. I was like, when people are hiring me because my resume had that many keywords on it, I'm like, well, it wouldn't have that many keywords on it if I'd done one job for 10 years. It would have like 2 keywords on it. And then you wouldn't want to hire me because you just said you want me to know these 3 backup tools for some reason. I don't know why you have 3 backup tools, but I can do all 3 of them. So I got the job. I think moving into consulting was a big eye-opener for me because I wondered why I hadn't got into it sooner. I'd moved around in a lot of operations roles and kind of, network manager, IT manager type roles, and architect roles. And I'd done all that before I became a consultant the first time. And I was like, well, this is great. I get a different set of challenges every couple of weeks, but it's the same skills. Like I'm doing VMware projects every week, but each couple of weeks it's a completely different set of challenges, completely different set of constraints. So that definitely kind of got me out of that kind of boredom funk of, working for the same customer doing kind of network management or network architecture. You're like, well, cool, man, we just did a big migration. We're not going to buy another 200 grand of networking gear anytime soon. So what am I doing now? Just keeping the lights on. And so, yeah, there's definitely, I speak to a lot of my peers and folks like that who go through those phases in their career. And it's like, find something that drives you, that challenges you. Because I think, if you get bored of what you do, you're going to be frustrated and wonder why you do it. You got to have joy in what you do, right? So, always be learning, always jumping from new tech to new tech. And at some point along the way, you find the balance of, it's not always about the newest thing. Like, sure, go learn it. But that doesn't mean you just go to work and say, we must use this. We must use this new thing that I've found. It's great. It's like it'll be replaced in a year by something newer, but we must go through all the rigmarole of deploying it, that kind of thing. So that's where the soft skills come in as well. I think that becomes more apparent to people as they become more senior, as they move into more leadership roles. But I think ultimately the soft skills are important regardless of where in your career you're at or at what level you're at. Like being able to influence people and talk to people and kind of negotiate with people, sometimes much more senior than you or in completely different departments of you, is super important to building your brand and kind of reputation, especially in big enterprises.
So as you have gone through your career and have different roles and kind of keep gaining seniority or technical prowess or whatever with the roles, how would you equate how valuable the different skill sets are? Technical skills versus soft skills as you go up the career ladder?
I think I think it very much depends on where you work and what they expect out of the role. Because again, role titles don't seem to mean anything. They mean something in context to where you're employed, right? So, I've had a title in one place and the job does not match the exact same title somewhere else. Like not even in a high level. So I think you got to figure out what that is first, but also what you enjoy, right? A lot of people, even as they move into leadership roles, they still enjoy being hands-on. I'm one of those people, right? I've got to be able to grok something by doing it, right? And from there, I can now talk about it. I can now talk about its pros and cons, but I'm not just going to read a blurb from the vendor and just assume it's gospel, because I've been around long enough to know that that's not generally true, right? There's always a gotcha there or a catch or something that I need to figure out after the fact. So, again, being able to kind of get hands-on with something and solve something, like even I don't I'm really, just do a bit of contract work now and then, helping some friends and stuff like that. But I'm still kind of, someone asked me the other day, I was reading the big red data intensive applications book as part of a book club. And someone's like, aren't you retired? Why are you reading this? I was like, well, I enjoy this. This is what I do. This is why I got to retire. So I got to kind of pack it in early, because I've been pretty successful, but I enjoy what I do, and I still have mentees. I still run a nonprofit and a conference and things like that. Like I still am in part of my community, right? So I think, depending on the role, I think, the soft skills will become more and more important as the role becomes more business focused. But I think even as a lead kind of IC in a technical space, that lead piece matters. Like being that senior IC, like it involves you being able to talk to other people, involves you being able to translate a technical idea into some other domain, whether that be business, whether that be finance, whatever. Like you've got to be able to plug those pieces in. Like meeting technical people who are like, oh, I love the cloud, I'm putting everything in the cloud. And it's like, cool, how much they cost? Well, I don't know. I don't pay the bill. I was like, that's not useful. That's not going to build the influence you think it's going to build. Right? Because someone does pay the bill, and at some point they're going to make a phone call and go, why is the bill so high? Like, do we even think about what we deployed, or did we just deploy the thing that sounded like it was the coolest thing, right? Again, that's less of a problem in big enterprises. They have a lot of governance around things like that. But I think for a lot of us who work in smaller mid-market companies where we maybe have, the keys to all the kingdom, like somebody's still footing the bill there, right? And like ultimately, like we gotta look at those things and be able to justify why this makes sense, be able to kind of, get sign off on a new project or a new tool, be able to kind of, ask nicely for a ticket to a conference. Like there's definitely a lot of value into that side of things as well.
So you mentioned that you're retired now, doing a little bit of consulting here and there with some friends, but you're still learning. So I think that just based on that, we can take away like maybe one of the secrets, not so secret, to your success has been your enjoyment, your process of learning. It's sort of being ingrained. Sounds like from a super early age, you've been all about learning. What were you into before tech stuff,
definitely.
though? I'm just a little bit curious. Like pre-tech, were you geeking out on Legos or?
Yeah, definitely a Lego kid. And I think you can probably see my Lego world map over my shoulder there.
Yes.
That I think my fingers bled putting that together. It's like
Oh,
10,000 pieces, but they're all the little flat ones with like that hurt. No, yeah, definitely was Lego. I remember before, so I actually weird because I got a computer pretty late. Like my parents weren't like well off or whatever. So my friends already had computers, and I remember getting my first 386 like slightly later. I think I got my first computer was an Amiga 500 in like, maybe it was 89 because it was the weird Batman edition that came out with the Batman movie. So I want to say it was that. And my friends had all had like Commodore 64s and stuff, and I never got one because my parents couldn't afford it or whatever. I think maybe my dad had a ZX Spectrum or some Amstrad that I got to play with, had like a cassette tape to play like Oregon Trail. Very strange. But yeah, no, I mean, always been that kind of, always want to pull things apart. There used to be this series of books that I remember reading at school. I think it was like Dorling Kinsley or something. They always had this like How Stuff Works books, and you'd open it and have a big picture, and it'd be like a cool cutout of something. You'd see like a slice of the Titanic, and you're like, oh, cool. There's the engine room, and so I was always into that kind of stuff. That was definitely me as a kid. But yeah, no, I think you can have natural talent in certain things, and I think a lot of technologists do. But I think if you don't have that willingness and eagerness to kind of learn and kind of round that out, you can definitely become stagnant. And I definitely know people in IT who are really good at the thing they do, but they don't do anything else. And that's perfectly fine for them. Some people love that. And that's great as well. But I've always joked that I've got to be on the bleeding edge, and then I've got to be able to translate which part of that bleeding edge is useful to the business in 6 months to a year, because it's definitely not all useful to the business. And I think that's where a lot of my success came from, is being able to bridge that gap and say, okay, this stuff's all cool, but this stuff is going to matter less. Right. And being successful at those kind of predictions, I think is definitely helpful. There's definitely a lot of luck, I think, that comes with that as well. Microsoft's a good example of a company that's got that wrong a few times, right? It's like, that doesn't mean that they haven't had massive success. It just means, even the biggest and brightest can definitely stumble in certain areas. Like Apple have done it, Microsoft have done it, I've done it. But yeah, there's definitely a bit of luck comes with it as well.
So was it kind of God, I don't want to keep saying secret to success, but was it impactful for you to have that kind of lot of jobs, a lot of exposure to a lot of different technologies? Like, how long are we talking at each job?
I don't think I ever worked. I very rarely worked anywhere less than a year, I'd say. I think when I hit 10 years in the field, I probably had about 12 jobs under my belt. So, I usually stuck around for a year or something. But I think that became very apparent when I became a consultant. All of that experience was super valuable when I became a consultant. Like prior to being a consultant, you found the right role that for some reason had 3 backup tools. You're like, cool. But when you become a consultant, like 1 week you're working with 1 backup tool, the next week you're working with another backup tool. Like that became very, very useful. So yeah, it definitely didn't necessarily have a huge impact at the early part of the career because I waited so long before I got into consulting. But as I moved to consulting, all of that experience ramped up, right? And again, a lot of, whilst I might be learning 3 backup tools, I was probably doing AD at all 3 of them. I was probably doing Exchange at most of them. You know what I mean? So those skills just built up and got deeper. And then the other tools kind of got necessarily wider. But it's interesting. One of the things we talk about when we talk about architects these days, and we talk about kind of like the T-shaped developer or the pie-shaped developer or whatever, and I use the word developer here in quotes. Any engineer would be a perfectly good analogy there, but you kind of need to have breadth, but also depth. But the wider you get, the broader your skill set gets, the more challenge you have maintaining depth. Like you can't be that deep in all those domains, right? You literally can't do it, right? You don't have the time for it. You don't have the brain cells for it, right? So finding out the things you are really passionate about and going deep in those, but then making sure you can support those things with all those other things. When I'm talking to people about architecture, I always say, it's interesting, like an architect who builds a building might not be the person who understands the HVAC sizing or the electrical stuff, but they know that when they design a building that 10,000 people are supposed to be in, they need enough ducting, they need enough space in the building envelope for that amount of ducting for that number of elevators for that number of bathrooms on each floor, right? That they have a gist of those other domains enough that they can inform their architecture, right? And if they don't, you get these buildings that like look great, but they're like completely unfunctional, right? And those buildings, they don't succeed, right? They don't generally get built, or they get built and then there's just horror stories about them for years. And the same could be said about technical architecture, right? If you go, oh man, I got this perfect architecture, it looks brilliant, it's well formed and has nothing wrong with it, and you're like, yeah, but I can't use it, like it doesn't do what I need it to do, right? So
I love those patterns where you can take something that seems technical in nature or a pattern or whatever, and then you just apply it to something else like building a house, and it still applies. I find that those things that are present in multiple domains seem to resonate the most as truthful to me. And I think that what you're speaking to is also really helpful about, understanding that you can't be the expert on everything. It's a very dangerous trap to try to fall into, but also sort of the importance of a variety of perspectives when solving any issue, right? It always is more valuable to have a broader perspective because nobody can see it all. Nobody's going to be right every single time. It's just literally impossible with how much stuff there is out there.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as you move into leadership, a part of that lesson is about surrounding yourself with people that complement that as well. Like, it's like you might be the big cheese, but the people around you, even your subordinates, they're there to complement you. They're not there to just do what you do. If they could do what you do, why are you here? Right? They're there to help you kind of, obviously fulfill your kind of mission, your kind of, ask, but also help complement the things that you might not be as strong in. Like if I'm really deep in AD, I maybe don't need as many AD people on the team, right? I probably need people that can do the needful, but I might need someone who's much better at networking or can do BGP in their sleep, right? And I'm like, I know enough about that to know I need that, right? But not necessarily enough that you want me dealing with an outage at 3 a.m. We'll call Bob up, who's much better at that, right? So.
And it sounds like your career led you to have a pretty wise perspective and broad exposure across a whole bunch of different technologies that would give you that understanding to know that you needed the network person and all that.
Yeah, it is interesting because when I'm talking with folks who maybe have less exposure to those kind of domains, it's interesting how they don't even think it could be that problem. Like we make the joke it's always DNS, right? And I think everybody's kind of jumped on that trope. It's always DNS. But if you ask most developers what DNS does, a lot of them would struggle. They couldn't necessarily tell you. And a lot of people in IT who don't work on the networking side, I don't even know what that does. I was like, it's always interesting to me because I'm like, well, if it's always DNS, you might have wanted to open a page or two about it. Right? It's a critical part of the requirement to make your thing do the needful. So no, as an example, right? Like again, I think we can all relate to the it's always DNS kind of trope, right? It's interesting recently because you now do see a lot of people kind of learning cloud infrastructure, like developers who are like, I don't need an ops person now, I can do that myself. And I was challenged that. I'm like, well, I'm glad that you can deploy the PaaS SQL server in AWS, but what do you know about optimizing it? What do you know about backing it up? What do you know about securing it? Like, and are you doing any of that? Do you even care about any of that? Because somebody paying the bill will care about it when it stops working, right? It's interesting. I had one client a couple of years back, and we called this workshop with them. And what was it? It was like a operations maturity or something, because they hated the word DevOps. We couldn't talk to them about DevOps because to them, DevOps was when the CFO gave the devs the credit card to AWS and said, knock yourself out. And all they did was get called about it like at 3 a.m, not even knowing what this asset was, not even knowing what this application was or why it was running. It was still their job to fix it. It was still their job to keep it operational. They didn't know nothing about it. But because the devs had the AWS keys, they could just deploy whatever they wanted. And that was kind of early DevOps for a lot of companies. They're like, oh, the devs can do the ops. But the ops still get called when the ops goes wrong, right? And so they hated the word DevOps. They're like, no, DevOps is the worst thing ever. And kind of, had to kind of walk them through. No, it's not that. It's not supposed to be that. At least let's kind of help you kind of get on board there. And like, what is actually DevOps? What is it supposed to be? And how your relationship with that team maybe should be different, right? But yeah, no, it's definitely been an interesting decade for sure.
Well, Ryan, I got some good takeaways here. I appreciate the conversation. And I want to say, everyone out there, thank you for listening. Drive safe, walk safe. New episodes every single Monday since like the beginning of time, several years now. And we'll have another one next Monday and then the next Monday. And same thing goes for PowerShell Wednesdays. And if you want to learn more about C#, check out Ryan's talk from PowerShell Wednesday. You also did a really good deep dive at PowerShell Summit, which I will also include in the show notes. All the links to your stuff, my good friend, will also be in the show notes. So no need to read off a URL. I'll have it there for you. Want to say thank you so much for joining me. Sorry, what was that?
No, definitely. I said all my URLs are really long. You don't want me to read them. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, that'd be great. No, it's been a good talk. I appreciate you having me on. And always still around in the community. I'm not as active in Discord and stuff, but most people know how to reach me on LinkedIn and stuff. If anyone's got questions or they want to pick my brain about C# or PowerShell, I'm always happy to help and happy to kind of give some advice where required.
Awesome. And hey, you can join us in the PDQ Discord, discord.gg/PDQ. The PowerShell scripting channel has been popping off. Always willing to take speaker suggestions, comments, critiques, all of it. But thank you so much, Ryan. I know you have a hard stop, and I want to be respectful of your time, which you have so graciously given us so much of. So hope you have a great rest of your day. Andrew. Yes.
Yeah, you too, mate.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.